There is a kind of knowing that comes before the words do, quiet as a candle being lit in a dark room, and just as certain. Miriam Troyer had lived her whole life on the edge of a knowing she had not yet named. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a harness maker, the keeper of a house that smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of a kitchen where bread had been baked so many mornings in a row that the walls themselves seemed to hold it. She had been baptized at 19 on a bright October Sunday, kneeling on the wide plank floor of the Kurtzs farmhouse, while Bishop Raber's voice moved over her like water. And she had felt in that moment not the solemnity everyone described afterward, but a kind of settling, as though something in her had been looking for the place it belonged and had finally stopped looking. She had not doubted it since. She did not think of this as virtue. It was simply the shape of her. The farm sat on a long, shallow rise above Walnut Creek Township, Holmes County, Ohio. The fields belonged to her father, Amos, though Amos's hands had grown slower in recent years, his left more than his right, and much of what the farm needed now fell to the men her brother Levi sent over on busy days, or to the rhythm of neighbors who did not wait to be asked. The harness shop stood separate from the house, a lean-to addition of weathered board that smelled of neat's foot oil and leather, and the faint sweetness of the glues Amos used on his repairs. Miriam helped there in the mornings when the household would allow it. She was good at the finishing work, at the small buckles and the stitching that held a thing together. The forge was older than the harness shop by 50 years. Her mother's father had built it, a low stone and timber building at the far edge of the yard where the grass gave way to gravel and then to the lane. It faced west, the wide door open to the afternoon light when the weather was good, and it had sat empty for 3 years after her grandfather passed before her father leased it to Jonas Byler 5 years ago. Miriam didn't think much about the forge in those first years of Jonas's tenancy. It was simply there, as it had always been, the thin thread of coal smoke rising from it on working days, the sound of the hammer carrying across the yard on still mornings, familiar and undemanding as birdsong. It was June when Dale Whitfield came back. He came as he always did, in a plain dark sedan, parking carefully at the end of the lane where it widened, walking up to the harness shop with his hands visible and his voice already pleasant before he reached the door. He was a tall man, brown-haired with the careful, considering manner of someone who had learned to move slowly in places where hurry was not respected. He worked for a regional magazine out of Columbus that ran long features on traditional craft and heritage trades across the Midwest. He had been to Holmes County 4 times now, twice to the woodworking shops in Berlin, once to a cheese house near Charm, and last summer he had stopped at Amish Troyer's harness shop on the recommendation of a furniture maker who told him the stitching alone was worth seeing. He had come back. Miriam was at the finishing bench when she heard his voice at the door, speaking to her father in that careful, respectful way he had. She did not go out immediately. She finished the buckle she was threading, set it on the cloth, and then walked to the doorway between the shop and the small room where her father kept his patterns. "Miss Troyer," Dale said when he saw her. He nodded, not pressing it. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. That was, more or less, the sum of it. He spoke with her father for 20 minutes about the bridal work Amos had just finished, took several photographs with quiet permission, and asked Amos 2 or 3 questions that showed he had actually read what he'd been told the previous summer. Miriam brought them water and then returned to the bench. She was aware of him the way she was aware of weather, something noted and accounted for without being consumed by it. When he left, her father came and stood in the doorway between the rooms for a moment. "Polite man," Amos said. This was, from Amos Troyer, a complete sentence. "Yeah," Miriam said and went on with the buckle. She did not tell Levy about the visit. There was nothing to tell. There never was with Dale Whitfield. That was, in some ways, the whole of the problem, and the whole of the reason it was not a problem at all, and Miriam understood this without needing to turn it over. He was decent and respectful and entirely, structurally impossible, and she had known this the first summer, and she knew it now. And the knowing required no action, no drama, no conversation with her brother or her bishop or anyone else. Some things resolved themselves simply by being seen clearly. This was one. July came in hot and thick, the way Holmes County Julys did, the air sitting low over the fields in the morning and not lifting until late afternoon when the thunderheads built up to the south. The second cutting of hay was done by mid-month, and the week after the word went through the district about the Schrock's barn raising in Walnut Creek Township, the old dairy barn having come down in a late spring windstorm. The Schrocks were an older couple, their children grown and scattered to neighboring districts, and the community turned out on a Tuesday with the particular purposefulness of people who did not need to be organized. Miriam came with the kitchen brigade, as she always did, arriving before 6 in the morning in the wagon with Ruth, her sister-in-law, and 2 other women from their church district. The men were already there. The foundation sills were set, the framing lumber stacked and sorted the day before, and by the time the sun was fully up, the air was already full of hammering and the shouts of men calling measurements to one another across the open frame. Miriam did not look for Jonas Byler. There would have been no reason to. She was at the long table under the temporary canopy the Schrocks had set up, slicing bread and arranging the cold cuts and the containers of potato salad and the pies that had come from a dozen kitchens. The morning had its own logic, its own momentum, and she moved inside it without resistance. It was the smell that reached her first. Coal smoke, faint and particular, the kind that clung to a coat and did not wash out entirely in a single laundering. She was carrying a pitcher of water toward the far end of the table when she caught it on the moving air, and she paused just for a moment without knowing why, and looked toward the rising frame of the barn. He was at the main door opening, a large man, wide through the shoulders, his hat pushed back slightly from the work. He was setting a hinge. She could see from this distance the deliberateness of it, the way he tested each placement before he committed to it, the way the other men near him seemed to naturally give him room without being asked. A younger man, one of the Kane boys, said something to him, pointing at the hinge. The large man tested it with his hand, twice, pressing and releasing. She could not hear what he said. She was 40 feet away with a pitcher of water and a table of food that needed attention. But she saw the keen boy nod, and she saw the way he accepted the answer, the way you accept something solid, and she turned back to the table and went on with her morning. She asked Ruth at the midday meal who the man working the door hardware was. "Jonas Byler," Ruth said without looking up from the pan she was uncovering. "Amish's blacksmith. You've not spoken to him?" "He's my father's tenant," Miriam said. "It's not the same as knowing him." Ruth looked up then, briefly, with the expression she sometimes wore when she was deciding whether a thing was worth saying. She decided against it. "Good work," she said instead, meaning the hinges. "I heard Eli Schrock say he drove 20 miles for that man's hardware before he found out he was 10 minutes away." Miriam did not reply to this. She filled the water glasses at the nearest end of the table and moved on. They did not speak that day, she and Jonas Baylor. He ate at the men's table, as was proper, and she was in the kitchen canopy, and the afternoon was full of work, and the barn frame rose board by board into the blue July sky with the clean purposefulness of a thing being set right. She thought about the hinge. She thought about the way the Keene boy had nodded. She thought about the coal smoke. And then she thought about something else, because there was always something else to think about at a barn raising, and that was what the day was for. She did not think about it on the drive home. She thought about it once, briefly in the kitchen that evening while she was putting the leftover bread away. And then she put that away too in the same unhurried motion and went to bed. August came, and with it the canning. This was the great work of the Amish kitchen, the weeks of sustained labor that turned the garden's abundance into the winter's provision. Miriam's kitchen was small but well ordered. She and Ruth worked together 3 days a week through the hottest part of August, Ruth bringing her own jars and her 4 children, the youngest of whom slept in the basket Miriam kept for this purpose near the south window. The kitchen was hot in a way that had its own texture, dense and fragrant, full of the steam rising from the canning kettle and the sweetness of tomatoes and corn, and the bright acid of the pickled beans. It was Ruth who mentioned Jonas. She didn't mean to start anything. Miriam understood this about Ruth, that she did not calculate her conversational openings the way Levi sometimes did, that she spoke from proximity to a thought rather than from intention. They were working the tomatoes, Miriam feeding the hand-cranked mill while Ruth managed the jars, and Ruth said, without particular emphasis, that Jonas Baylor had repaired the frame on their cellar door that week without being asked, had seen it pulling away from the house stone when he drove past, and had simply appeared one morning and set it right. Levi didn't ask him to, Miriam said. No, Ruth said. He just came. Miriam cranked the mill. The tomatoes moved through it in a red stream, patient and unhurried. Did he say anything? She asked. He said the frame needed setting before winter or the coal would get into the joint, Ruth said. And then he left. Miriam thought about this. She thought about a man who drives past a thing that is wrong and does not drive on. Then Levi came in through the back door, still in his work clothes, stopping to wash his hands at the pump by the step before he entered, and the conversation became something else. He was a large man, Levi, with their father's deliberate hands and their mother's careful eyes, and he moved through the kitchen with the practiced economy of a man who has learned not to take up more space than necessary in a room where women are working. He accepted the cup of water Miriam gave him and stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching the canning operation with the mild, satisfied expression he always wore when things were being done correctly. Whitfield was at Dad's again, he said. Not a question. Last week, Miriam said. He came about the bridal work. Levy said. There was a weight to it. Not heavy-handed, just present. Miriam did not look up from the mill. He came about the bridal work, Levi. Levi drank his water and said nothing further. And after a few minutes he went back outside, and the kitchen returned to its steam and its rhythms and the particular companionable silence that Miriam and Ruth had built over many years of working together. But Ruth, Miriam noticed, did not bring up Jonas Baylor again that day. There is a particular way that Amish communities hold a person's history. It is not quite memory, and it is not quite judgment, though it resembles both. It is something more like the way a field holds the shape of what was built on it, the slight rise of an old foundation, the depression where a root cellar was filled in. You can farm right over it. The field will grow. But the shape is there, in the lay of the land, for anyone who knows how to read it. Jonas Baylor had left Holmes County when he was 18, as many young people did, stepping into the years the community sets aside for such a leaving, the years of Rumspringa, when the Ordnung's weight is eased and the world outside is permitted to make its case. Most young people tried the outside for a year or 2 or 3 and came back. Jonas had stayed for 6. He had returned at 24 spent a year attending services and sitting in the community's patient, watchful fellowship, and been baptized at 25 by Bishop Raber with the same words that had been said over every baptized member for generations. He had given no account of the 6 years. The community had not demanded one. This was correct according to both doctrine and custom. A man who presents himself for baptism has made his accounting to God, and the community receives him at his word. This is what the faith requires. But faith and memory are not the same thing. The district received Jonas Byler, and it remembered also that he had been a long time coming. These two things existed alongside each other without contradiction, the way the field holds both the crop and the old foundation. And Jonas had lived inside this quiet duality for 5 years now, without complaint and without explanation, building his reputation board by board, hinge by hinge, in the only way a man can build it, by showing up and doing good work and letting the work speak for as long as it needed to speak before anyone listened. He was not a man who required understanding from others to function. This was perhaps the most important thing about him, and the thing most easily mistaken for coldness by those who did not know him. He had been somewhere, and something had happened there that had clarified everything, and he had come home, and he was here. That was, as far as Jonas Byler was concerned, the whole of the story available for public accounting. The rest of it he kept, not from shame. From the particular reverence of a man who knows that some griefs are not improved by being explained. If you are listening tonight from somewhere quiet, maybe a kitchen of your own, or a car at the end of a long day, or a room that has finally gone still, I want you to stay with me here for just a moment, because this is the part of the story where it would be easy to misread Jonas Byler. It would be easy to see a man who keeps his own counsel and think, there is something hidden there, something incomplete, something that is not finished becoming what it is. I understand that reading. The district understood it too. But I have known people who are quiet because they are afraid, and I have known people who are quiet because they have already done the work that loud people are still trying to get through. Those two silences do not sound the same, if you listen carefully. The community of Walnut Creek Township was listening, in its slow and patient way. And what it heard, in the ring of the hammer and the hinge that would hold, and the cellar frame set right on a morning when no one asked, was a man who had finished becoming what he was and was simply now being it. October arrived with its cold mornings and its long golden afternoons, the sugar maples along the Troyer Lane going red and amber, while the fields lay stripped and stubbled after the harvest. The apple harvest was in. The root cellar was full. There was a particular exhale that happened in an Amish household in October, after the summer's labor and before the winter's long interior season, when the pace slackened just slightly and the evenings lengthened around the supper table. On the second Sunday of the month, which was an in-between Sunday, no church service, the district gathered for a work frolic at old Lena Yoder's farm, 2 miles up the road. Lena was 81 and still sharp, but her fences had suffered a summer of neglect, and her son, who lived in Indiana now, had sent word that he would come in November to help, which was not November yet. So the community came, without announcement and without ceremony, the way it always came to such things. Miriam came with her father. Levi and Ruth came with their children. The work sorted itself naturally, the men to the fencing and the women to the house, where Lena had made coffee in an enormous pot and set out a plate of sugar cookies that she had clearly spent the previous day baking in preparation for being helped. Miriam worked the fence line in the late morning, carrying replacement posts from the wagon to the men who needed them, because she had always been willing to do the work that moved between categories, and because Lena's pasture fence stretched 2 fields and posts were heavy. It was on her 3rd trip that she rounded the corner of the back field and found Jonas Byler setting a post, 3 positions down from where Levi and another man were working. She set the post down near him without ceremony. He looked up. "Miriam Troyer," he said. Not a greeting exactly. More like a recognition, the way you say a landmark's name when you pass it. "Jonas Beeler," she said in the same register. He nodded and went back to the post he was tamping. She watched his hands for a moment, the unhurried efficiency of them, and then she picked up the next post to carry and walked back toward the wagon. On her next trip, she set the post and did not speak. On the trip after, she set the post, and he said, without looking up, "How is your father's left hand?" She paused. "Better in warm weather," she said. "He manages." "He's good with the smaller work," Jonas said. "Better than most for the finishing." "He is," Miriam agreed. Neither of them said anything else. She went back to the wagon, but something had shifted in the air between them, something small and precise, the way a window shifts on its sash when the latch is turned, but before it is pushed open. That evening, Levi sat with Ruth after the children were in bed and said what he had been working up to for a week. "I've seen the way he watches her," Levi said. Ruth was mending. She did not put the mending down. "Who watches who?" she said, though she knew. "Byler," Levi said. "At the Schrock raising. At Lena's today." Ruth's needle moved. "Jonas Beeler watches the work in front of him," she said. "Same as Miriam does." "Ruth?" "Levi." She said it the same way he'd said her name, level and quiet. "What is it you're worried about exactly?" Levi was quiet for a moment. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which was one of the reasons Bishop Raber had his eye on him for the deaconate, and one of the reasons this particular conversation was difficult, because thinking before he spoke meant he had to examine what he actually thought, and what he actually thought was complicated in ways that did not sit neatly. "He was gone a long time," Levi said finally. "He came back," Ruth said. 6 years. "He came back," she said again simply. "And he's been here 5 years since. That's 11 years of accountable time, Levi, to weigh against the 6. Levi said nothing. Ruth's needle moved. "She's 27, Ruth said more gently now. "She's not a girl who needs protecting from a good man who works hard and keeps his word." Levi stood and went to the window. Outside, the October night was cold and very clear, the stars hard and numerous above the fields. He did not say what he was actually thinking, which was that he had held his sister's hand at their mother's graveside when she was 11 years old and he had been 14, and that she had not cried, but her hand had been very small in his, and that some part of him had never entirely let go of it. Miriam came to the forge on a Wednesday morning in late October, carrying a slip of paper with the dimensions for a new latch her father needed for the harness shop door. The old one had finally given it the pin after 20 years of use, and Amos had sketched what he wanted and asked Miriam to bring it over. The forge was already at work when she arrived, the coal smell heavy in the cool morning air, the glow of the fire visible through the half-open door. She knocked on the door frame and waited. Jonas came to the door with his apron on and a pair of tongs in one hand. He looked at her without surprise. He had the particular quality of a man whom nothing quite unsettles, not because he is indifferent, but because he has already, in some private manner, accounted for most of what the world might send him. "Miss Troyer," he said. "My father needs a latch," she said, and held out the paper. He drew the dimensions. Jonas took the paper, studied it for a moment, and then stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold," he said. "I need to check against what I have in stock." She followed him in. The forge was warm, considerably warmer than the October morning outside, and her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. The space was orderly in the way a working forge needs to be orderly. not tidy for its own sake, but arranged by function. Every tool at its distance from the fire, the stock sorted along one wall, the finished work on a shelf near the door. She noticed on that shelf an assortment of small finished pieces, hooks, brackets, a set of hinges, a handful of garden stakes. "Your grandfather built this well," Jonas said, not looking up from the stock shelf. "The draw on the chimney is better than most. He knew what he was doing." "He did," Miriam said. Jonas found what he was looking for, held it up against the dimensions on the paper. He set it back and moved to another section. "How long have you been in Holmes County?" she asked. She said it as a practical question, covering the silence. 5 years tenanting here," he said. "Grew up here. Born on the Eli Byler place off Township Road 606. "I know that farm," she said. "Then you know the land," he said. "Long slope down to the creek. Good soil." "Yeah." He found the right stock bar and set it on his workbench, running his thumb along the length of it. The gesture was so automatic she understood it was not done for her benefit. It was simply the way he knew a thing, by feel, by the grain of it under his hands. "I can have it by Friday," he said. "Same pin design as he drew, or better if you want to tell him I said so." "He'll want what he drew," Miriam said. A small sound came from Jonas that might have been a laugh, or the suggestion of one. "He's a man who knows his own mind," he said. "He is," Miriam said. She looked around the forge, at the shelf of finished work, at the particular quality of light coming through the west-facing door. Then she looked at the piece Jonas had pulled from stock, the bar he would work into her father's latch. "Will it be strong enough?" she said. She gestured at the bar. "It's a working door. He's in and out of that shop 8 times a day." Jonas picked up the bar, tested it with his thumbs in a way she had not seen before, a kind of precise and knowing pressure at the center of the length. Then he set it down on the bench. "It will hold," he said. She looked at him then, directly, the way she rarely looked at people she had not decided about, the way she looked at her father and at Ruth, and at the work in front of her when she was trying to understand it. He was looking back at her with the same quality she had first noticed at the barn raising, that steadiness that was not blankness, that held something without pressing it forward. She did not know what she was seeing. She thought she did not know, and told herself she did not know, and looked away first. "Friday, then," she said. "I'll tell him." "Friday," Jonas said. She walked back out through the wide door into the cold October morning, the coal smoke following her a few steps out before the clean air took over, and she went up the gravel to the house without looking back. Her grandfather's mounting block was beside the door, the old limestone cube weathered smooth on top. She had climbed it as a child when the draft horses were still kept here, and she had wanted to reach their necks. She passed it without stopping. Inside, she went to the front room and stood for a moment near the settee, where her mother's 9-patch quilt lay folded over the back, blue and brown, the last several rows still unfinished, the way it had been for 16 years. She laid her hand on it. The fabric was cool and very still. She thought about a bar of iron stock under a man's thumbs, and the certainty in his voice, and the way she had looked at him, and he had looked back without flinching and without pressing forward. She thought, "I do not know what that was." She thought, "That is not the same as it being nothing." Then she took her hand off the quilt and went to the kitchen to start the noon meal, and the morning settled over the farm like it always did, patient and unhurried, and the faint sound of the hammer began again from the forge at the edge of the yard. November came to Holmes County the way it always did, without apology, the last of the color gone from the maples overnight, and the fields settling into their long gray rest. It was wedding season, the weeks the community set aside for the joining of households. And in Miriam's district, there were 2 weddings in the first 2 weeks of the month. Both on Thursdays, both beginning before 8 in the morning and lasting well into the afternoon with the singing and the meals and the particular festive gravity that an Amish wedding carried, solemn and joyful in the same breath. Miriam attended both. She came with her father and with Levi's family, taking her place among the women on the left side of the gathered congregation, her hands folded in her lap through the long morning service, her voice joining the others in the slow, unaccompanied hymns that moved through a room like something older than any of them. She liked weddings. She always had. There was something in them that was not about longing, or not only about longing, but about the evidence of faithfulness, the plain fact that 2 people had decided and were here to say so in front of everyone they loved. Jonas Byler was at the first wedding because the groom, a young man named Samuel Graber, had commissioned the door hardware for his new house from Jonas's forge, and the 2 had developed the easy acquaintance of craftsmen who respect each other's work. Jonas sat with the men, 2 rows ahead and to the right of where Miriam sat, and she was aware of this the way she had become aware of the coal smoke. As a fact, she noted and then tried to set aside and did not entirely succeed in setting aside. She watched him sing. He did not perform the singing, did not shape his face into anything. He simply sang, the old German words, the slow and winding melody that congregations had been pulling through the same hymns for 300 years, and his voice was a plain baritone that gave the notes their weight without demanding notice. She looked away. At the noon meal, the tables were arranged by seniority and family, and Miriam was at the women's table nearest the kitchen, helping serve as much as eating. Jonas was at the far end of the men's long table, speaking to an older man she recognized as a minister from the Charm District. She did not look in that direction more than twice. She was quite certain she had not looked more than twice. The second wedding was the following Thursday. Here the seating placed them, by the geometry of the house and the number of guests, directly across the central aisle from each other, close enough that the arrangement was simply the arrangement, and there was nothing to be done about it. The service was long, 2.5 hours of scripture and counsel, and the vows that never changed. And Miriam kept her eyes on the bishop and her hands folded, and did not look across the aisle. Almost never. She was nearly certain she looked across no more than once and found him already looking at the bishop, which was what everyone was doing, and she returned to looking at the bishop herself. After, at the meal, he passed her on his way to the men's table and said, "Miss Troyer," in that same register, recognition rather than greeting, and she said, "Jonas," without the surname this time. She didn't know why. And he moved on, and she sat down and Ruth looked at her with an expression that Miriam chose not to interpret. Levi, by this point, had begun to do something careful and quiet that Miriam would not learn about until February. He had spoken to 2 men he knew in the Andy Weaver district, men who had known Jonas before his room Springer and after his return, asking about his character, his conduct, the nature of his 6 years away. He framed these conversations to himself as due diligence, the kind of private inquiry that a protective older brother and a deacon in training might reasonably undertake. He was not, he told himself, doing anything improper. He was asking questions that any responsible man might ask. What he learned was unremarkable. Jonas Byler had been a young man who left, spent years away, and returned settled and purposeful. He owed no one money. He had not left debts of any kind, financial or otherwise, that anyone in either district knew about. His work was excellent. His word was reliable. He had transferred his membership to the old Order District 5 years ago through the proper channels and with the full cooperation of both bishops. There was nothing, in other words, to find. Levi received this information and felt, not reassured, but more unsettled than before, with the particular unsettledness of a man who has gone looking for a reason and come back without one. January arrived and the forge went quiet. There was less work in January. The barn-raising season was over. The fall hardware orders had been filled. The horses that needed shoeing before winter had been shod. Jonas worked on smaller commissions, on sharpening and repair, on the kind of bench work that did not require the full fire and could be done in the cold hours of the short days with a focused economy of effort. He also, in January, made things that no one had asked for. He had always done this. It was not a new habit. When his hands were between commissions, they moved anyway, working through the iron with the same unhurried attention he brought to the paid work, and what came out of those sessions was various and small. A hook with a slightly unusual curve to it, a bracket made finer than its function required, a garden stake shaped with a simplicity that was almost architectural. Most of these he kept on the shelf by the door. Some he gave away, quietly and without explanation, to people he wanted to acknowledge without having the words for it. He had made the cross-shaped garden stake for the Troyer kitchen garden 2 winters ago. He had walked to the garden in the early morning and set it at the corner where he had noticed the climbing beans tended to lose their line at the end of the season, and he had gone back to the forge and not mentioned it. He did not think of this as significant. He thought of it as a thing that needed doing. In January of this year, he sat at his bench on a cold afternoon with a length of flat stock that was too narrow for hardware and made a bookmark. It took him 2 hours. He worked the edges smooth, filed the top end to a slight curve, and stamped a small, simple pattern into the flat face, not decorative exactly, more like the evidence of care. When he was done, he held it in his palm and looked at it for a while. It was the length of a Bible page and the width of his thumb. He left it at the Troyer back door before first light on a Thursday morning, tucked into the doorframe where it would not blow away. He did not leave a note. He put his hands back in his coat pockets and walked down the lane to the forge and lit the fire. Miriam found it when she went out to bring in the milk at 5:30. She stood in the cold, dark doorway and looked at the small, flat piece of iron in her hand. She ran her thumb along the edge, which was smooth, and along the stamped pattern in the center, which was a series of small, regular marks that might have been wheat stalks, or simply might have been the shapes his tool made when he was thinking clearly. She knew, without question and without having to reason toward it, who had left it. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer than the cold justified. Then she went inside and set the iron bookmark on the kitchen table, while she brought in the milk and strained it and put the kettle on. And when she sat down to her first cup of the morning, she picked it up again and looked at it in the lamplight. Then she carried it to the front room and placed it inside her Bible, at the page where she had been reading in the mornings, which was Psalms, and she left it there. She did not speak of it to anyone. She did not need to speak of it. There are some things that do not require witnesses. She knew what it was. She knew what it was not. It was not a declaration. It was not a question. It was something more precise than either. Something that said, I have been paying attention. I wanted you to know. I want to stop here for just a moment, if you'll let me. Wherever you are tonight, whatever room or road or quiet corner of the world you found to listen from, I want to ask you something. Have you ever known something clearly? Known it with the kind of certainty that sits in your chest rather than your head, and still been afraid to let it be true? Not because you doubted the feeling, but because letting it be true meant something would have to happen. Something would have to change, and change, even toward a good thing, carries its own particular weight. Miriam Troyer knew. She had known, if she was honest, since the barn raising in July, which was before she had spoken a word to the man, which tells you something about the nature of this kind of knowing. She had known more clearly since the forge in October. She had known with a quiet and settled completeness since the moment she stood in the cold doorway with a piece of iron in her hand before the sun came up. She was not afraid of the knowing. She was patient with it, the way she was patient with most things that mattered, not because she was passive, but because she understood in her bones that some things are not improved by being rushed. She held what she knew the way the winter holds the ground, not suppressing it, just keeping it until the season is right. The iron bookmark stayed in her Bible. She read Psalms every morning and held it in her hand while she read. February came in hard, the coldest stretch of the winter, with a week of temperatures that kept the horses in and the buggies in, and the community largely in its own houses, visiting by necessity rather than by plan. The forge stayed warm because Jonas kept it warm, working the fire every day whether there was commission work or not, because the building was old and stone held cold badly, and he had learned in his first winter there that a forge left cold for too long was a forge that cracked. It was on the first milder day, a Tuesday in late February, when the temperature rose to just above freezing and the road was passable, that Levi came to the forge. He came alone, without announcing himself in advance, which was not unusual for a man visiting a craftsman about business, except that Levi did not have business at the forge. Jonas saw him coming down the lane from the window and was not surprised. He had been, in some practical part of his mind, expecting something like this for several months. He opened the wide door fully and stood in it when Levi arrived. "Levi," he said. "Jonas," Levi said. He came inside, which Jonas had not explicitly invited but did not move to prevent. He stood in the middle of the forge with his hat in his hands, which Jonas noticed, the hat coming off as a gesture of seriousness rather than deference. "I'll speak plainly," Levi said. "I'd prefer it," Jonas said. Levi looked at him for a moment. He was not an unkind man, and he knew it, and he wanted Jonas to know it, and he could not quite find the opening for that, so he went past it. "My sister is a woman who has had enough unsettlement," he said. "She had one situation that ended badly, and she carried it quietly and went on, and I watched her do that, and I won't watch her do it again." Jonas said nothing. He was leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed, not defensively, simply the posture of a man who is listening and has decided to continue listening until the other man is done. "You were gone a long time," Levi said. 6 years is a long time, and I'm not saying a man can't come back and be steady. I'm not saying that." He paused. "But she's 27, and she doesn't need a situation that's going to ask more of her than it gives. And I don't know you well enough to know what you'd ask." Jonas waited a moment after Levi stopped speaking, to be sure he was stopped. Then he said, "What ended the situation with Ezra Mast?" Levi's jaw tightened. "That's not your business." "I'm not asking because it's my business," Jonas said. "I'm asking because you just told me your sister has been unsettled once, and you don't want it to happen again. And I'm trying to understand what you think unsettlement looks like. Because from where I'm standing, your sister seems to me like one of the most settled people in this district. Not because nothing has happened to her. Because of how she carries it." Levi said nothing. "I haven't spoken to Miriam about anything beyond her father's latch and a fence post," Jonas said. "If something is going to happen beyond that, it will happen correctly, and she will be the one who decides it, same as I will. That's how it works. You know that." Levi's hands moved on his hat brim. "You were gone 6 years," he said again, and this time it came out differently. less like an argument and more like something he was still trying to put down. "I was," Jonas said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was lower and more deliberate than anything he had said before, "I had a friend who died in those years. He was 22. It took me a while to understand what I wanted to do about that. I came home when I understood." He paused. "I'm not asking you to find that satisfying. I'm telling you so. You have what you came for." Levi stood very still. "You should ask her what she wants, Levi," Jonas said, "not tell me what she needs." There was a long silence in the forge. The fire worked quietly in the background, the only sound in the building. Then Levi put his hat back on and walked out through the wide door without another word, and Jonas watched him go up the lane and did not move from the bench for a long time. Miriam learned what had happened from Ruth, who had learned it from Levi, who had come home that evening and sat at the kitchen table and told his wife the whole of it in a flat and careful voice that Ruth recognized as the voice of a man who knows he has done something he cannot entirely defend. Ruth told Miriam on Saturday when Levi was out of the house. She told it plainly because she and Miriam had always dealt in plainness, and she watched Miriam's face while she told it and saw something move through it that was not anger exactly, though anger was part of it, but something more like the expression of a person who has been spoken for without being asked. Miriam was quiet for a long moment after Ruth finished. "He had no right," she said, not loudly, quietly the way she said most things, but with a weight under it that Ruth had not heard from her in years. "No," Ruth said, "he didn't. He went there without telling me, without asking me, as though I was." She stopped. She pressed her lips together, as though what I might want was a problem to be managed. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over Miriam's. She did not say that Levi meant well, though he had. She did not say that he loved her, though he did. She understood that these things, true as they were not what Miriam needed to hear right now, and she was wise enough to not say them. Miriam did not speak to Levi for 3 weeks. She was in the same rooms with him at church and at her father's table, and at the shared Sunday meal at his house, and she spoke to him when it was necessary, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a correct and careful distance that Levi felt with the precision of a man standing next to something that has gone cold. He knew why. He did not try to explain himself to her. He understood in the way that honest people eventually understand such things, that there was no explanation available that would serve him better than silence. It was Amos who finally spoke. He waited until a Sunday evening when Levi had stayed late at the farm to help with a repair on the barn loft ladder, and the two of them were alone in the barn, with the lantern and the smell of old hay and wood. And Amos set down his end of the board he was holding and looked at his son. "You went to the forge," Amos said. Levi did not ask how he knew. "Yeah," he said. Amos was quiet for a moment, turning a nail in his fingers the way he turned small things when he was thinking. "When your mother was sick," he said, "do you remember what she asked for?" Levi said nothing. He remembered. "She asked to be let alone to manage it herself," Amos said. "She didn't want fussing. She didn't want decisions made around her. She wanted to be the one who decided how she carried it." He set the nail down on the board beside him. "You get that from her, Levi, the wanting to hold things steady for the people you love. There's nothing wrong in it." He paused. "But she also would have told you the same thing I'm telling you now. Your sister is not a problem to be solved. She's a woman making her way, and the best thing you can do for her is what your mother always wanted from you." He picked up his end of the board again. Get out of her road. Levi picked up his end. Neither of them said anything else. That night in his own house, after his children were in bed, Levi sat by the window for a long time. He thought about his mother's hand, small and very still in the last days. He thought about Miriam at 11 years old, not crying. He thought about a man in a forge who had lost a friend and come home and built something out of it, year by year, hinge by hinge, without requiring anyone else to understand him, and who had said, "You should ask her what she wants." He thought about the fact that this was precisely what he had never done, not once. Through all of it. In the morning, he went to Miriam before she started the breakfast and said, without preparation or softening, "I was wrong to go there. I should have come to you first, and I didn't. And I was wrong." Miriam looked at him for a moment. She was holding the kettle. The kitchen was just beginning to smell of the fire she had started. "Yeah," she said. "You were." He nodded. He had not expected her to make it easier for him, and she did not. And he respected her for it with the particular respect of a person who is receiving exactly what they deserve. She set the kettle on the stove. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat. She made coffee. They did not talk about Jonas. They talked about the loft ladder and the children and the planting calendar for April. And it was not yet mended what had been pulled loose between them, but it was on its way, the way a field mends after a hard winter, not suddenly but inevitably, given enough time and the right season. April arrived. The ground softened. The Troyer farm woke up in the way farms wake up in spring, the particular urgency of it, the sense of too much to do and exactly enough time to do it. And Miriam was in the garden 3 days after the frostbite had safely passed, turning the beds with the broad fork and setting her seed markers in the rows. And she was aware, as she had been aware all winter and all through the gray margin of March, of the forge at the edge of the yard and the coal smoke rising from it and the sound of the hammer. She had not been back to the forge since October. She had sent her father with small errands twice. She was not avoiding it, she told herself. She was patient. She was letting things be what they were, and trusting that what needed to happen would happen in its own time. She was also, if she was honest, a little afraid. Not of Jonas, not of the community, not even of Levi, not anymore. She was afraid of the particular vulnerability of being the one who steps forward first, of opening the door and finding out whether what she had been keeping through the winter was as real as it felt. She understood this fear. She did not think poorly of herself for it. She simply noticed it the way she noticed the shape of the old foundation under the field, and she went on with the work. It was her father who settled it, though he did not know he did. He came into the kitchen one morning in late April and stood at the table with his slow left hand resting on the wood and said, "I'd like to have Jonas Byler to supper sometime, before the planting gets fully underway and everyone's too busy." Miriam looked up from the bread she was shaping. "He's been a good tenant and a good neighbor," Amos said, "and I've never once had him to the table." He said it with the particular mildness of a man who has thought about something for a long time and has finally decided it is simple. "Would you manage that?" Miriam looked at her father's face. He was looking back at her with those careful, steady eyes that had watched her for 27 years and knew her better than anyone alive and offered her now, in the plainest possible way, a door. "Yeah, Dad," she said. "I'll manage it." She didn't go to the forge that day. She went the next morning, a clear May morning, the first genuinely warm one, the kind that made the whole winter feel, in retrospect, like something that had been worth wading through. The apple trees in the side yard were just at the edge of blooming. The lane was dry. She walked down to the forge without a reason, without a slip of paper from her father, without an errand of any kind, and she knew that he would know this. The wide door was open to the morning light, the way it always was when the weather was good. The fire was going. She could hear him at the bench before she reached the door. She knocked on the doorframe. He came to the door and looked at her. He looked briefly at her empty hands. He did not say anything. "My father wants to have you to supper," she said, "before the planting." "All right," Jonas said. She didn't move to go. He did not move to make the conversation easier, and she was glad he didn't because she had not come for easy. She looked past him into the forge, at the shelf by the door where the finished work sat, and she saw that there were fewer pieces on it than there had been in October. Most of them had been given away, she supposed, in the way he gave things, quietly and without needing to be thanked. She could see the mounting block outside the door in her peripheral vision, her grandfather's limestone cube, smooth on top. She sat down on it. He came and sat in the doorway, his back against one side of the frame, his legs stretched out into the morning. This was, she thought, the correct arrangement, neither of them inside and neither of them fully outside, both of them in the threshold, where the warmth of the forge and the warmth of the spring morning met and became indistinguishable. "I know what you said to Levi," she said. He waited. "You were right to say it," she said. "He should have come to me." "He loves you," Jonas said. "He doesn't always know what to do with it." She looked at him. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," he said. "Generous would be pretending he wasn't wrong. He was wrong, and he loves you. Both things are true." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the apple trees at the edge of the yard, the white blossoms just showing at the tips of the branches. "I found the bookmark," she said, "in January." He nodded once. "I've had it in my Bible since then," she said. He looked at her with that steadiness that was not blankness, that held something without pressing it. He did not fill the silence with anything. He let it be what it was, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was the whole of the conversation conducted without words for all the months that had led to this one. "I'm afraid," she said, "that too much has been made difficult, between Levi and the district and your history, and the questions that don't have tidy answers. I'm afraid that there's too much pulling at the edges of a thing before it's even started." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into the doorway behind him and picked up something from the bench just inside the door, a small finished piece she hadn't noticed when she walked up, and he held it out to her. It was a hinge, a fine one, made for a cabinet or a box, something small and well considered. The pin fitted perfectly, the leaves balanced exactly. She took it from him and tested it herself, opening and closing it in her fingers. It moved without effort and without looseness. It was, she thought, made by someone who understood that the point of a hinge is not the opening or the closing, but the connection that makes both possible. She looked up. "It will hold," he said. She looked at him then the way she had looked at him in the forge in October, directly and without reservation. And this time, she did not look away first. This time, she understood what she was seeing. She had understood for a long time. She was simply, finally, letting it be true. The morning held them there in the threshold of the old stone forge, the warmth of the fire behind him and the apple blossoms ahead. Her grandfather's limestone mounting block under her and the hinge in her hands, the coal smoke faint in the still air, the whole of the farm going on around them with its unhurried spring business. She closed the hinge and held it in her palm. "Friday, then," she said. "For supper. Come at 6. "I'll come at 6, Jonas said. She stood up from the mounting block and walked back up the gravel to the house. She did not look back. She didn't need to. She went inside and through to the front room and stood for a moment at the settee, looking at her mother's unfinished 9-patch quilt, the blue and brown squares, the last several rows waiting these 16 years. She reached out and lifted one corner of it, looking at where the work had stopped, at the needle her mother had left in the fabric so long ago that it had been there longer than Miriam could remember. Patient and ready. She sat down on the settee. She found her sewing basket in the drawer of the side table. She threaded a needle. She began. There is a kind of knowing that comes before the words do. Miriam had known for longer than she would ever admit. And now, at last, so did everyone else. The story is not really about a blacksmith or a forge, or even a woman choosing between two worlds. Those are the clothes the story wears. What it is actually about is this. Choosing slowly is still choosing. Patience, in a life built on plainness, is not the same as fear. Miriam Troyer did not drift toward Jonas Byler. She moved toward him the way the season moves, without hurry and without doubt, holding what she knew through the hay season and the barn raising and the canning, and the quiet November wedding days, and the long gray winter and the cold morning doorway with the iron in her hand, holding it the way her grandfather's limestone block held the weight of anyone who needed to stand a little higher, to reach something, steady and without complaint, until the morning when she simply sat down on it and let the thing be true. She finished her mother's quilt that spring. She did not rush it. It came out well. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it waiting. Subscribe, and I'll see you next time.